Hello there and welcome back. Tonight we're going to ride slowly through the entire lore of Hosea Matthews, one of the oldest, wisest, saddest and most quietly important figures in Red Dead Redemption 2. Hosea is not the loudest man in the Van Der Linde gang. He does not fill the camp with grand speeches the way Dutch does. He does not carry the visible tragic weight of Arthur Morgan, or the wild restlessness of John Marston, or the obvious poison of Micah Bell. Hosea's power is softer than that. He is the old fox by the fire, the con man with tired eyes, the second father, the planner, the negotiator, the voice of caution, and the man who remembers what Dutch used to be before the dream began turning rotten. So let the camp settle. Let the coffee steam rise in the early morning. Let the old canvas tents breathe in the dark. Tonight we are following Hosea Matthews from his early outlaw years, through love and loss, through the founding of the gang, through his bond with Arthur and Dutch, and finally toward the Saint Denis street where the last wise voice of the gang is silenced. Hosea matters because he represents the version of the Van Der Linde gang that almost could have been. Dutch gives the gang its dream, its language, its romance, and its dangerous hunger for meaning. Hosea gives it patience, wit, caution, and a practical understanding of people. He knows how to talk, how to charm, how to lie without needing to shout, how to watch a room, how to read weakness, and how to steal without turning every theft into a war. If Dutch is the preacher of the gang, Hosea is its old theatre manager, keeping the show from collapsing when the leading man begins to believe his own lines too much. Hosea was born long before the events of the game, and by 1899 he is already an old man by outlaw standards. His age matters because he belongs to an earlier world than many of the younger gang members. He has seen more schemes, more towns, more failed promises, more dead friends, more versions of Dutch than almost anyone else. When Hosea speaks, he is not speaking from innocence. He is a criminal too. He has lied, robbed, cheated, and survived by deception. But age has given him something Dutch increasingly lacks: the ability to recognise when a life is coming apart. Before the gang becomes a camp full of familiar names, Hosea is already a con man. That word is important. He is not first defined as a gunfighter, though he can handle danger. He is not first defined as a brute, though he knows the outlaw road. He is a man of performance, disguise, persuasion, and timing. A con man survives by understanding what people want to believe. That makes Hosea unusually insightful, because he knows illusion from the inside. He knows how dreams are sold. He knows how pride can be baited. He knows how greed makes people careless. Most painfully, he knows how Dutch's own dream works because he helped build it. Hosea meets Dutch Van Der Linde in the late 1870s, and the story of their meeting already sounds like a legend told around a campfire. The two men encounter each other on the road, both clever, both criminal, both trying to gain the advantage. One version of the story says they each realised they had tried to rob the other, and instead of becoming enemies, they recognised a kindred spirit. That is the perfect beginning for them. Their bond is born not from honesty, but from mutual recognition inside deception. Each man sees that the other knows how to play the world. This first meeting tells us a great deal about their partnership. Dutch is charismatic, philosophical, proud, and hungry for a larger meaning. Hosea is sharp, playful, practical, and harder to fool. Together they become more than two criminals on the road. They become the seed of a family, a gang, a travelling counterworld built against banks, railroads, lawmen, and the modern order closing around the frontier. But from the beginning, the partnership contains imbalance. Dutch wants belief. Hosea knows belief is useful, but dangerous. Dutch wants the story. Hosea knows every story has a cost. The Van Der Linde gang begins with Dutch and Hosea as co-founders, though Dutch's name becomes the one history remembers most loudly. This matters because Hosea is not simply an advisor who wanders into someone else's organisation. He is there at the foundation. He helps form the early identity of the gang, stealing from the rich, helping those in need when possible, living outside the law, and making survival feel like a moral stance rather than only crime. Hosea is part of the original dream before it becomes corrupted by desperation, pride and blood. In the early years, Hosea and Dutch are not merely partners in crime, they are brothers in invention. They invent a way to live, and then they invite others into it. That invitation becomes both blessing and curse. For lost people like Arthur Morgan, the gang offers shelter, teaching and belonging. For people like John Marston, it offers rescue from a cruel world. For others, it offers work, food, community, or at least a place to stand. Hosea helps make that possible. Yet the same family will one day become the place where loyalty is used as a chain. Arthur Morgan enters Hosea's life as a boy, and this is one of the most important relationships in Hosea's lore. Arthur is taken in young, shaped by Dutch and Hosea together, and raised into the outlaw life. Dutch gives Arthur ideology, confidence, and the dream of standing against a corrupt world. Hosea gives him something quieter, humour, craft, restraint, and a model of intelligence that does not need to announce itself. Arthur's later complexity comes partly from being raised between these two fathers. Dutch teaches him to believe, Hosea teaches him to see. Hosea's fatherly place in Arthur's life is not sentimental in an obvious way. He does not constantly weep over Arthur or speak in grand declarations of love. Their bond is built from years of riding, planning, teasing, surviving, and growing older together. Arthur respects Hosea deeply, and Hosea sees Arthur more clearly than many people do. He knows Arthur is not merely a brute. He knows there is thought, loyalty, pain, and hidden gentleness under Arthur's rough exterior. Hosea's presence helps explain why Arthur is more than Dutch's weapon. He had another father beside the dreamer. John Marston also grows under the influence of Dutch and Hosea after Dutch saves him from being hanged as a child. Hosea becomes part of the older structure that raises John into the gang. The relationship is different from Arthur's because John is younger, wilder, more restless, and eventually more visibly resistant to Dutch's control. But Hosea's place still matters. John grows up in a family where Dutch speaks ideals, and Hosea offers practical wisdom. When Hosea dies, John loses not only an old gang member, but one of the few elders who might have helped him understand a way out before Dutch's collapse became fatal. Hosea's love for Bessie is one of the softest and saddest parts of his history. Bessie Matthews is dead by the time the main story takes place, but her absence shapes Hosea's melancholy. She was his wife, and their relationship shows that Hosea once tried to live differently. At one point, Hosea and Bessie left crime for a time, travelling and trying to make a quieter life. This detail matters because Hosea was not trapped in outlaw life by ignorance. He saw another road. He even stepped onto it. But he drifted back. Bessie accepted Hosea for who he was, and that acceptance seems to have been one of the deepest comforts of his life. When he speaks of her, there is affection, regret, and the ache of someone who knows love did not save him from himself. Bessie understood his criminal nature, or at least understood enough of it to stay with him even when he returned to the life. That makes Hosea's grief complicated. He did not simply lose a wife, he lost the person who knew the best and worst of him, and still loved him. The fact that Hosea tried to leave crime with Bessie gives his later warnings more weight. He is not merely telling Dutch to slow down because he is cowardly or old. He knows what it means to imagine leaving. He knows how strong the pull of the outlaw life can be. He knows how easy it is to tell yourself that one more job will create freedom. Hosea has lived the lie from the inside. That is why he can sense the danger in Dutch's plans. He has made similar excuses to himself before. Bessie's death leaves Hosea with a quieter kind of loneliness than many members of the gang carry. Arthur has Mary in his past, and his regret is tied to a life he could not enter. Dutch has Annabel in his past, and her death becomes part of his feud with Colm O'Driscoll. Hosea has Bessie, whose memory is less theatrical but perhaps more intimate. He does not turn her into a public legend. He carries her like an old wound under the vest. She is mentioned in small places, and the smallness makes the grief feel more real. When Hosea and Arthur hunt the legendary bear near the start of Chapter 2, Hosea mentions being in that country with Bessie. The moment is quiet, but it opens a whole earlier life. The Grizzlies are not only a hunting ground or a wilderness challenge. For Hosea, they are connected to a time when he and Bessie travelled away from the gang and crime. The landscape becomes memory. Snow, trees, cold air and old trails bring back a marriage, a possible escape, and a version of Hosea who was not only Dutch's partner. That bear hunt, in Exit Pursued by a Bruised Ego, is one of the best early windows into Hosea's character. He is older, careful and aware of danger, but not useless. He knows the country, knows how to tell a story, knows how to tease Arthur, and knows when a risk has become too large. The legendary bear becomes a symbol of the older outlaw meeting something wild that cannot be conned. Hosea can trick men, read towns, and plan robberies, but nature does not negotiate the same way. That humility is part of his wisdom. Hosea's decision not to keep chasing the bear alone also tells us something. He is not trying to prove himself through foolish bravery. He has lived long enough to understand that survival sometimes means stepping back. This separates him from Dutch, who increasingly confuses retreat with betrayal and caution with weakness. Hosea can admit when a situation has shifted. Dutch often cannot. In a world where pride kills men, Hosea's willingness to stop is its own form of strength. The black shire horse given to Arthur after the bear mission is another small piece of Hosea's lore. Hosea tells Arthur the horse is difficult and suggests selling it, but Arthur can keep it. On the surface, this is a practical horse detail. Underneath, it shows the old rhythm between them. Hosea gives advice, but Arthur chooses. Hosea does not need to dominate every choice. His fatherhood is not like Dutch's control. He offers guidance, jokes, warnings and experience, but he does not constantly demand worship. Hosea's role as a con man appears beautifully in The Spines of America, where he helps Arthur with a stagecoach robbery involving Seamus. This mission reveals a different kind of outlaw work from the explosive robberies Dutch increasingly favours. Hosea's methods are quiet, sly, and built around timing. He is comfortable with lies, disguises, and manipulation, but he prefers a job that can be done without unnecessary violence. That preference is central to him. He is a criminal, but not a blood-drunk one. He would rather steal with a smile than shoot through a town. Seamus, the fence at Emerald Ranch, becomes part of Hosea's practical network. Hosea understands that crime is not only the act of taking, it is the system around taking. Contacts, buyers, stories, risk management, and careful movement of stolen goods. This is another way he differs from younger or rougher gang members. A reckless thief thinks about the robbery. Hosea thinks about the whole route from idea to money. He knows a job is not finished when the thing is stolen. It is finished when everyone gets away and nobody has drawn too much attention. Hosea's intelligence is not academic in the formal sense, though he is certainly educated by experience. His intelligence is social. He reads people. He understands vanity, fear, greed, politeness, and the small ways people reveal themselves. This makes him valuable in a gang that contains many stronger gunmen than planners. Arthur can fight, John can ride, Javier can shoot, Bill can intimidate, Dutch can inspire, but Hosea can walk into a room and know which lie might open the door. The tragedy is that Hosea's gift for reading people does not allow him to fully stop Dutch. This is one of the most painful parts of his law. He sees Dutch changing. He challenges him. He worries about the gang's direction. He dislikes Micah. He pushes for quieter plans. But Dutch is not just another mark in a con. Dutch is his friend, brother, co-founder, and the man Hosea has spent decades beside. Hosea can read the danger, but love and history make action harder. Seeing clearly is not the same as escaping. Hosea's relationship with Dutch is one of the central tragedies of Red Dead Redemption 2. They began as equals, or close to equals, two clever criminals building a life on the road. By 1899, Dutch still acts like the singular leader, while Hosea has become the older conscience beside him. Their friendship is real. Their history is real. But Dutch increasingly treats disagreement as disloyalty, and Hosea increasingly sees that the dream is becoming a mask for Dutch's ego. The partnership that founded the gang cannot survive the man Dutch is becoming. In camp, Hosea is often treated with respect by nearly everyone. This matters, because respect in the Van Der Linde gang is not automatic. The camp contains egos, tempers, fears, rivalries, and resentments. Hosea's authority comes from age, intelligence, and history rather than force. He does not need to threaten people constantly. He has earned his place through decades of usefulness and care. Even when younger members tease him, they understand he is one of the pillars holding the gang upright. Micah Bell is one of the few people Hosea openly distrusts, and that distrust is deeply important. Hosea sees something wrong in Micah's nature early. Micah is loud, cruel, opportunistic, and eager for violence. He flatters Dutch in exactly the way Dutch becomes most vulnerable to. Hosea's dislike of Micah is not a random personal irritation. It is the old con man recognizing another kind of manipulator, one without Hosea's restraint, affection, or loyalty. Hosea knows a poison when he sees one. Micah's rise after Hosea's death is one of the clearest signs of what Hosea had been preventing. While Hosea lives, Dutch still has someone close enough and old enough to challenge him. Hosea can call him foolish, warn him, push back, and remind him of the older dream. Once Hosea is gone, Micah has more space to whisper into Dutch's pride. That does not mean Hosea alone could have saved the gang forever, but his death removes one of the last strong brakes on Dutch's collapse. Hosea's moral position is complex because he is not innocent. It would be false to turn him into a saint. He is a thief, a con man, a lifelong outlaw, and a man who helped raise boys into crime. His wisdom does not erase the harm he has done. But Red Dead Redemption 2 often finds tragedy in people who are guilty and still capable of love. Hosea's importance lies in that mixture. He has sinned, but he has not lost his ability to care. He has lied, but he can still recognize truth. He has stolen, but but he does not worship violence. This is why Hosea often feels like the gang's conscience, even though he is a criminal. Conscience does not always belong to the innocent. Sometimes it belongs to the guilty person who has finally learned what guilt means. Hosea knows enough about wrongdoing to fear its consequences. He knows that the gang's old justifications are wearing thin. He knows that robbing banks and trains in a changing country is becoming more dangerous. He knows that the age of easy escape is ending. Dutch turns that pressure into louder dreams. Hosea turns it into worry. The world of 1899 is essential to understanding Hosea. He is an old outlaw at the end of the outlaw age. The West is changing. Railroads, banks, Pinkertons, cities, telegraphs, federal power and modern police systems are closing the open spaces where men like Hosea once survived. Hosea can feel this more clearly than Dutch because he is less addicted to fantasy. He knows the old tricks still work sometimes, but less often. He knows the cost of one mistake has grown heavier. The world is no longer generous to clever criminals on horseback. Dutch responds to this historical pressure by making the dream bigger. Tahiti, one last score, freedom, loyalty, faith, noise, speeches. Hosea responds by trying to make plans smaller, cleaner and less bloody. This contrast defines their late relationship. Dutch wants a grand escape from reality. Hosea wants reality handled with enough care that the gang might survive another day. Neither man fully wins. The story belongs to the collapse that comes when the grand dream refuses the practical warning. Hosea's bond with Arthur becomes more poignant because Arthur begins to hear the warnings more clearly as the game progresses. Early Arthur is still loyal to Dutch in a deep, almost instinctive way. He may grumble, but he follows. Hosea's doubts are part of the background weather. As Dutch unravels, Arthur's own doubts come forward, and Hosea's earlier caution begins to look less like old man's fear and more like prophecy. By the time Arthur truly sees the shape of Dutch's failure, Hosea is gone. This is one of the saddest structural choices in the game. Hosea dies before Arthur's moral awakening is complete. The man who might have understood Arthur's shift most gently is not there to see it. Arthur becomes more Hosea, like in certain ways after Hosea's death. More cautious about Dutch, more protective of the vulnerable, more aware that the gang's old story is failing. But Hosea cannot guide him through the final chapter. Arthur must carry that inherited wisdom alone, while sick, grieving, and surrounded by worse voices. Hosea's relationship with Abigail is quieter, but meaningful. Abigail represents the domestic future the gang often fails to protect. She wants safety for Jack, and eventually wants John to become a better husband and father. Hosea, who loved Bessie and once tried to leave crime, can understand the value of that longing. He does not reduce Abigail's desire for safety to weakness. A man who has lost his wife and failed to stay straight knows that a home is not a small dream. It may be the hardest dream of all. Hosea's relationship with Jack also matters, because Hosea belongs to the older generation that understands children should not be raised only in outlaw camps. Jack's presence makes the gang's contradictions visible. Dutch speaks of family, but the gang's life endangers the only child in camp again and again. Hosea is old enough to feel that contradiction. He may enjoy Jack's presence, but he also knows, whether he says it plainly or not, that a child cannot thrive forever under canvas, gunsmoke and false promises. In Chapter 2, Horseshoe Overlook gives Hosea a brief space to function as the gang's stabilizing elder. The camp is recovering from the Blackwater disaster, the weather has softened, and for a little while the gang can pretend there is still time. Hosea's presence suits Horseshoe because the chapter has air in it. There is planning, hunting, small crime, camp life. and the possibility of choosing carefully. Hosea belongs to that slower rhythm. He thrives when there is room to think. Blackwater haunts Hosea even though the story never shows the robbery itself. The failed ferry job has scattered the gang into the mountains and cost them money, safety, and members. Hosea was not the architect of the chaos in the same way Dutch was, and he worries about what the job revealed. Blackwater is the first visible sign that the old methods are failing. It is also the beginning of Dutch's need to recover control through bigger and riskier moves. Hosea senses that danger early. The missing money from Blackwater becomes a symbol of impossible return. Dutch keeps talking as if one more score will restore everything. But the gang is already changed. Hosea understands that money alone cannot repair judgment. If leadership is failing, if attention is too high, if violence is increasing, then more cash may only buy a little time. Hosea is practical enough to want money, but wise enough to know money is not the same as salvation. Dutch increasingly forgets the difference. Hosea's sense of humour is one of his gentlest traits. He can be dry, teasing and playful, especially with Arthur. That humour keeps him from becoming only a gloomy prophet. He is old, tired and worried, but still alive to absurdity. This is important because real wisdom often arrives with humour, not solemnity. Hosea knows the world is foolish, and he knows the gang is foolish too. The joke can carry affection, warning and resignation all at once. His humour also reveals intimacy. Hosea can tease Arthur because there is history between them. He can argue with Dutch because there is history there too. He does not speak as an outsider delivering moral lectures. He speaks as someone who has earned the right to be annoyed. This is why his warnings hurt. They come from inside the family, not from a lawman or rival. Hosea is not attacking the gang when he worries about it. He is trying to keep it alive. During Chapter 3, Hosea participates in the gang's attempts to exploit the feud between the Greys and Braithwaites. This shows both his cleverness and the gang's growing danger. The plan seems like classic con work. Play two rich families against each other, find opportunities, take advantage of pride and hatred. Hosea is suited to that kind of manipulation. But Rhodes becomes a trap of its own. The families are more dangerous and more tangled than the gang expects, and the result is blood, betrayal, and Jack's kidnapping. The Rhodes chapter reveals the limits of Hosea's methods. He can con individuals and read social weakness, but the gang is now operating inside larger, more volatile systems. Old family feuds, local power structures, law enforcement, and hidden interests make the situation harder to control. Hosea's style depends on subtlety, but the gang's presence is becoming too loud. Arthur, Dutch, and the others cannot stay invisible long enough for cleverness to protect them. The world is tightening. The fishing trip with Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur in the New South is one of the most beautiful, quiet moments in the game. The three men ride together, talk, fish, and briefly resemble the old family they once were. Hosea jokes about himself and Dutch as an old couple, and Arthur sits between them like the son they both raised. The scene matters because it shows what is being lost. Before the betrayals, sickness, and final collapse, there is still warmth. The tragedy needs that warmth to hurt. That fishing trip also shows the original triangle of the gang: Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur. Dutch is the dream, Hosea is the caution, Arthur is the loyal son trying to hold both. On the water, they can still laugh. The world has not yet fully broken them. But the peace is temporary. Red Dead Redemption 2 often places its most tender scenes before disaster. The quiet fishing line becomes more painful later, because we know how soon the old balance will vanish. Hosea's ability to reminisce without fully lying is part of his emotional depth. He remembers better times, but he does not seem as committed as Dutch to pretending those times can be restored unchanged. Dutch uses the past as fuel for speeches. Hosea uses the past as memory, sometimes comfort, sometimes warning. This difference is subtle, but crucial. Dutch wants the past to prove he is still right. Hosea lets the past remind him what has already been lost. When Jack is kidnapped by the Braithwaites, the gang's fantasy of clever control collapses. The feud was supposed to be exploitable, but it becomes personal and catastrophic. Hosea, like the others, is pulled into the violent response at Braithwaite Manor. This is one of the game's strongest images of the gang acting as a family. They march together through firelight to retrieve a child. Hosea's presence in that response matters because he cares about the family, not only the plan. Yet the event also proves the gang has become visible and vulnerable in ways a clever con cannot fix. The move to Shady Belle after the Rhodes disaster brings the gang closer to St. Denis, and this shift changes the emotional terrain around Hosea. Shady Belle is a grand old house full of decay, a fitting place for a gang whose dream is rotting. Hosea belongs uneasily there. He can function in civilization, but he does not trust what the gang is becoming near the city. St. Denis represents modernity, density, law, wealth, and surveillance. It is exactly the kind of place where small mistakes become deadly. Hosea is not afraid of cities in a simple way. As a con man, he understands urban spaces, social games, and polite deception. But St. Denis is different because the gang is already too hot, too wanted, too desperate, and too violent. A small con in a city may be possible. A major bank robbery after a string of chaos is another matter. Hosea's tragedy in Chapter 4 is that even his own planning cannot fully protect the gang from the consequences of everything that has happened around it. Angelo Bronte's role in the St. Denis chapter reveals the danger of Dutch's wounded pride. Bronte humiliates the gang by setting them up with the trolley station job, and Dutch cannot let the insult pass. Hosea sees the danger in making revenge part of strategy. He understands that killing Bronte will bring heat, attention, and spiritual ugliness. When Dutch insists on vengeance, Hosea's warnings become sharper. He knows the gang is walking from crime into damnation. Hosea's line of warning around Bronte is one of his clearest moral moments. He understands that some actions change the air around everything that follows. Killing a powerful city figure is not just another crime. It escalates the conflict, draws attention, and reveals that Dutch's judgment is being driven by ego. Hosea can accept theft. He can accept lies. But he increasingly cannot accept Dutch's need to answer humiliation with blood. That shift from survival crime to pride crime is part of the gang's doom. The killing of Bronte, especially Dutch feeding him to an alligator, is one of the moments where Hosea's old partnership with Dutch becomes almost impossible to reconcile. The Dutch he knew may always have had vanity and violence, but this is something darker, more theatrical, and more cruel. Hosea's reaction is not just tactical concern, it is horror at what his friend is becoming. The dream is no longer merely illegal, it is beginning to look monstrous. Yet after Bronte's death, Hosea still participates in the plan to rob the St. Denis bank. This is one of the most complicated parts of his lore. He warns, doubts, resists, and sees the danger. But he still helps plan the biggest job. This does not make him foolish in a simple way. It makes him human and trapped. The gang needs money. The pressure is enormous. Hosea may believe that one well-planned score could still get people out. He may also be exhausted enough to reach for the same old solution despite knowing the world has changed. The St. Denis bank job is often remembered as Hosea's plan, and that makes his death even more tragic. The planner dies in the plan. The old fox is outfoxed by the Pinkertons, by the city's readiness, by the gang's accumulated heat, and perhaps by the simple fact that the world has become too tight for such a robbery. Hosea's intelligence is real, but it is not magic. A clever man can still be caught when the whole net has already begun closing. Hosea and Abigail create a distraction for the bank robbery, which shows Hosea still relying on performance rather than brute force. He is doing what he has always done: draw attention, misdirect, create a story, help the others enter the real target. But this time, the performance fails. The Pinkertons are ready. Milton captures Hosea, and the old rules of the con collapse. The stage does not protect the actor anymore. Milton executing Hosea in the street is one of the most shocking deaths in Red Dead Redemption 2, because it is public, abrupt, and brutally symbolic. Hosea is not given a duel, a long speech, or a final clever escape. He is dragged out, held as a warning, and shot in front of the gang. The man who spent his life talking his way around danger is killed by a man who no longer wants to negotiate. Modern law, private force, and state-backed violence have no patience for the old con man's charm. Hosea's death also marks the death of restraint inside the gang. Lenny dies soon after, adding youthful tragedy to elder tragedy, but Hosea's death has a special structural weight. With him gone, Dutch loses the oldest counterbalance in his life. Arthur loses a father, the gang loses its planner, the camp loses one of its few universally respected voices. The dream loses the man who still remembered its better shape. After Saint Denis, the gang is not merely wounded, it is morally unmoored. The image of Hosea's body in the Saint Denis street is devastating, because he dies in the modern city, not in the open wilderness. He is swallowed by the very world he knew was becoming too dangerous. Saint Denis is crowded, industrial, policed, and full of systems larger than any outlaw family. Hosea's death there feels historically exact. The old outlaw cannot charm the 20th century away. The city catches him, displays him, and kills him as a message. Arthur's grief after Hosea's death is quieter than some other emotional moments, partly because the bank robbery immediately becomes chaos. There is no time to mourn properly. The gang must flee, Lenny is killed, John is captured, and the survivors are thrown toward Guarma. This lack of mourning is part of the tragedy. Hosea deserved a campfire, a burial, stories, and tears. Instead, his death becomes one more shock in a disaster too large to process. The family has no room left for proper grief. Dutch's reaction to Hosea's death is complex and troubling. He is clearly affected, but the loss also removes a challenge to his authority. In the chapters after Guarma, Dutch becomes more erratic, paranoid, and cruel. It would be too simple to say Hosea alone would have saved him, but Hosea's absence makes Dutch's decline faster and less resisted. The friend who could argue from shared history is gone. Micah's voice fills more of the empty space. Micah benefits from Hosea's death because Hosea saw him too clearly. While Hosea lived, Micah's influence had a strong opponent near Dutch. Hosea did not respect Micah's violence, flattery, or selfishness. After Saint Denis, the gang's power structure shifts. Arthur is doubting but sick and increasingly isolated. John is captured. Charles and Suddy are loyal but not founding voices. Micah has more access to Dutch's fear. The old fox is gone, and the rat moves closer to the centre. Hosea's death also changes how the camp feels. The camp after Guarma is not the same community. Shady Bell becomes memory, Lakay becomes desperation, and Beaver Hollow becomes sickness, paranoia, and collapse. Hosea would have hated Beaver Hollow. It is damp, dark, miserable, and spiritually rotten. More than that, it is a camp where Dutch's language of family has become thin and threatening. Hosea's absence can be felt in every argument Dutch wins too easily. Arthur's later moral clarity can be read partly as Hosea's inheritance. Arthur does not become Hosea, but he begins to see what Hosea saw. He recognises Dutch's decline, Micah's poison, John's need to escape, Abigail and Jack's vulnerability, and the failure of the gang's old dream. Hosea's caution becomes Arthur's late wisdom, sharpened by sickness and grief. The tragedy is that Arthur has to learn fully after the person who might have guided him has died. Hosea's relationship to violence is one of the most important parts of his character. He is not non-violent, and he has lived a violent life. But he dislikes unnecessary killing. He sees murder as dangerous morally and practically. This separates him from men like Micah, who enjoy cruelty, and from late Dutch, who increasingly turns violence into proof of will. Hosea understands that every body creates consequence. A dead man has friends, lawmen, witnesses, patterns, and spiritual weight. Killing is never as clean as desperate men pretend. This is why Hosea's cons feel almost elegant compared with much of the gang's later work. A clean con humiliates greed without filling a street with corpses. It still harms people, and Hosea knows that, but it contains less chaos. His criminal ideal is not innocence, it is control. He wants the gang to survive by being smarter than the world, not louder. The tragedy of Red Dead Redemption 2 is that the gang becomes too loud for Hosea's intelligence to save. Hosea's age also gives him a different relationship to death. He is not eager to die, but he knows death is close in a way younger men do not. He jokes, reflects, and moves with the weariness of someone who has already outlived many versions of himself. This gives his scenes a twilight quality. He is present, useful, sharp, and funny, but there is a sense that he belongs to memory even before he dies. He is the old story walking through its final chapter. The name Hosea itself carries a biblical echo, though the game does not need to underline it. Hosea in the biblical tradition is associated with prophecy, faithlessness, and warning, and Red Dead's Hosea often functions as a warning voice inside a faithless family. Whether intentional in every detail or not, the resonance fits. Hosea Matthews is the man who tells the gang, again and again, that the path is dangerous. Like many warning voices in tragedy, he is not listened to enough until after he is gone. Hosea's last name, Matthews, sounds plain and grounded, fitting his role as a practical man rather than a mythic self-inventor. Dutch Van Der Linde's name has grandeur and flourish. Hosea Matthews feels more modest, more weathered, more human. This contrast suits them. Dutch turns himself into an idea. Hosea remains a person. That difference becomes more important as Dutch loses himself in performance. Hosea's plainness is a kind of dignity. Curzon de Belle's performance as Hosea gives the character much of his warmth. Hosea's voice carries age, wit, and tired affection. He can sound amused, irritated, sad, or sharp without needing to push too hard. This matters because Hosea's power is tonal. He is not a character of explosive entrance, he is a character of presence. The voice makes him feel like someone who has told 1,000 lies and a few hard truths, and now knows exactly how both taste. Hosea's clothing also tells a story. He dresses with an old-fashioned neatness, often looking more like a gentleman trickster than a rough killer. His style supports his conman identity. He can pass in polite spaces more easily than someone like Bill. He understands presentation. Clothes are part of the lie, but also part of self-respect. Hosea has lived by performance for so long that appearance becomes a tool and a habit. Even in camp he carries a trace of the old stage. His physical frailty in 1899 is important too. Hosea coughs, tires, and shows signs of age. He is not the strongest body in the gang, and he knows it. But Red Dead Redemption 2 does not make him useless because of that. It gives him value through mind, memory, and judgment. The gang's tragedy is partly that it stops valuing those things enough. In a crisis, men like Dutch and Micah increasingly favour boldness and force. Hosea's softer power becomes easier to ignore precisely when it is most needed. The campfire stories and conversations around Hosea reveal a man who can be honest about disillusionment. He knows the gang has changed. He knows killing has become more common. He knows Dutch is not listening the way he once did. These moments matter because they show Hosea's conscience working in real time. He does not simply become a symbol after death. He spends the living story worrying, doubting, remembering and trying, in his own limited way, to slow the fall. Hosea's love for the gang is real, and that love is what traps him. If he did not care, he could leave. He has skills enough to vanish into another town, another con, another name. But he stays because Dutch is his friend, Arthur is his son in everything but blood, John is family, and the camp is full of people who depend on the old structure. Love keeps him near the fire even as the fire begins to spread. That is one of the saddest truths about him. He knows the gang is doomed before he can make himself abandon it. This loyalty is different from Dutch's demanded loyalty. Hosea does not constantly ask people to prove faith in him. He serves the group through planning, warning, and work. Dutch turns loyalty into obedience. Hosea treats loyalty as responsibility. That difference becomes clearer as the story darkens. When Dutch says loyalty, he often means do not question me. When Hosea shows loyalty, he questions because he cares. The tragedy is that Dutch increasingly cannot tell the difference. Hosea's attitude toward money is also more grounded than Dutch's. He wants money because money buys food, movement, safety and options. Dutch increasingly treats money as a symbol of escape. Proof that the dream can still be saved. Hosea's practicality is healthier, but even he is not free from the lure of one last score. The St. Denis bank robbery proves that desperation can make even practical men reach too far. Hosea is wise, but he is still part of the gang's shared sickness. The gang's shared sickness is the belief that freedom can be purchased by one final act of crime. Hosea knows better than most that this belief is dangerous, yet he cannot fully escape it. This makes him more tragic than if he were simply right all the time. He sees the flaw but still participates in the pattern. That is human. People can understand the trap and still step into it because the alternative feels worse. Hosea's death is the cost of knowing and hoping anyway. The relationship between Hosea and Dutch can be compared to an old marriage in the way the game itself sometimes jokes. They know each other's rhythms, irritations, weaknesses and histories. They bicker because the bond is deep. But like an old marriage under strain, the bickering reveals more than comedy. Hosea can no longer trust Dutch's judgment as he once did. Dutch can no longer bear Hosea's correction as he once might have. Their affection remains, but the shared language is cracking. Dutch's increasing need for admiration makes Hosea's honesty harder for him to tolerate. Hosea does not flatter him the way Micah does. Hosea remembers too much. He remembers Dutch before the legend, before the speeches became armour. To a man like late Dutch, That kind of friend can feel threatening. Hosea's very presence says, "I know who you were." Micah says, "You are still magnificent." In the end, Dutch chooses the voice that feeds him, not the voice that knows him. This is one reason Hosea's death is narratively necessary for Dutch's full collapse. As long as Hosea lives, Dutch is still connected to the origin of the gang in a human way. Hosea is a mirror from before Dutch became swallowed by performance. Once that mirror is shattered, Dutch can look instead into Micah's flattering reflection. The old truth dies in St. Denis, and the false image grows stronger in Beaver Hollow. Hosea's death also foreshadows Arthur's. Both men are fatherly figures in different ways, both see Dutch's decline, both are betrayed by the failure of the dream, and both die before the first Red Dead Redemption begins. Hosea dies suddenly in public violence. Arthur dies slowly through sickness and final choice. Hosea's death removes wisdom from the gang. Arthur's death removes its heart. Together, they mark the end of any version of the Van Der Linde family worth saving. The absence of Hosea in Red Dead Redemption, set years later, is felt indirectly through Dutch and John. By 1911, Dutch is a ghost of his former self, and John is hunting remnants of the old life. Hosea is long gone, but one can imagine how different things might have been if his influence had survived longer. He might not have prevented every tragedy, but his absence helps explain the bleakness of what remains. The old con man took a piece of the gang's soul with him when he died. Hosea's relationship to Arthur's journal is indirect but meaningful. Arthur writes, draws, and reflects in a way that suggests he has learned to observe the world carefully. Hosea, as a con man and father figure, likely helped cultivate that observational habit. Arthur sees details, people, animals, buildings, and faces. Hosea's influence lives in that way of watching. Dutch teaches Arthur to interpret the world through ideals. Hosea teaches him, quietly, to notice the actual person across the table. The legendary bear hunt is also important because it places Hosea and Arthur in nature rather than among people. Con men and outlaws spend much of life manipulating human systems, but the wilderness strips that away. The bear does not care about stories, status, or charm. Hosea's respect for the animal and the danger shows a man who can still be humbled by reality. Dutch increasingly cannot be humbled without becoming enraged. Hosea can be frightened and still remain himself. Hosea's willingness to let Arthur continue the hunt alone if he chooses is also a small sign of trust. He knows Arthur is capable. He does not need to prove his own bravery by staying. He can step back and let the younger man decide. That dynamic is healthier than Dutch's relationship with Arthur, where trust often comes tangled with expectation and emotional debt. Hosea's fatherhood is less possessive. He wants Arthur alive, but he does not need Arthur's loyalty to become worship. The con with Seamus also shows Hosea's enjoyment of craft. There is pleasure in a well-run trick, in knowing which lie to tell, in slipping through a situation without firing half the town awake. Hosea's criminality has style. This style is not morally pure, but it reveals a kind of artistry. He belongs to a tradition of tricksters, card sharps, travelling salesmen, and smooth-talking thieves who understand that words can steal more quietly than guns. Red Dead Redemption 2 mourns that tradition even while judging it. Hosea is also important because he gives the gang an older model of masculinity than pure aggression. He can be witty, tender, sick, frightened, clever, and respected. He does not need to dominate through volume. He is not embarrassed by caution. He can remember his wife with softness. In a camp full of men trying to prove themselves through guns, Hosea offers another kind of manhood. One based on experience, humour, intelligence, and the ability to admit danger. This makes his conflict with Micah even sharper. Micah represents the ugliest form of frontier masculinity, cruelty as proof of strength, violence as entertainment, women treated with contempt, loyalty used as a tool, and survival reduced to selfishness. Hosea represents a criminal masculinity that still has manners, affection, and limits. Both are outlaws, but the moral distance between them is enormous. When Micah rises after Hosea dies, the gang's masculine culture becomes harsher and more poisonous. Hosea's relationship with Susan Grimshaw is part of the older gang structure too. Susan manages camp discipline with severity, while Hosea manages strategy and memory. Both belong to the old order before Micah's corrosion and Dutch's paranoia fully take over. They are not the same kind of person, but both understand that a group survives through work, roles, and standards. The later collapse is not only ideological, it is domestic. The routines that kept camp functioning begin to break down as the old anchors die or lose authority. Hosea and Pearson also share the practical side of gang life, though in different domains. Pearson feeds the camp. Hosea helps keep money moving. Both remind us that outlaw life is not only shootouts and speeches, it is meals, supplies, horses, fences, medicine, and plans that do not always sound dramatic. Hosea's intelligence is practical because the gang's survival is practical. Someone has to know where goods go, who can be talked into what, and when a risk is too visible. Hosea's attitude towards Sadie Adler is not as central as Arthur's relationship with her, but his presence in the gang helps create the space where she first survives. Sadie enters after her home is destroyed, and the older gang structure still contains enough care to shelter her. Hosea belongs to that structure. By the time the gang collapses, Sadie becomes one of the people acting with clearer loyalty than Dutch. In a broad sense, she inherits the practical moral side Hosea represented: help the people who need helping, not the leader's ego. Hosea's absence during the later rescue of Abigail is painful, because he would have understood what Dutch's refusal meant. Dutch leaving Abigail behind is the final betrayal of the family language. Hosea, who knew the value of a wife, a home, and practical loyalty, would have seen the disgrace clearly. The fact that he is gone makes Dutch's failure feel even lonelier. Nobody from the founding generation remains to shame him properly. Hosea's death before Guarma also means he never sees Dutch's behaviour on the island. Guarma strips the gang down to survival, and Dutch's violence there becomes more openly disturbing. One wonders how Hosea would have reacted. He might have been horrified, he might have argued, he might have failed to stop it. But his absence allows the story to show Dutch without the old moderating voice. Guarma becomes a place where the dream has no elder beside it, only desperation and force. The Pinkertons killing Hosea rather than arresting him also reveals their message. Milton wants to break the gang's spirit. Hosea is not just another outlaw body. He is the elder, the planner, the respected second in command. Killing him in front of the others is psychological warfare. It says the age of negotiation is over. It says the old men will not be allowed to retire into legend. It says the modern order will answer outlaw romance with public execution. Milton's act also reflects the Pinkertons' own brutality. Red Dead Redemption 2 does not present law as pure goodness. The gang is criminal and often destructive, but the forces hunting them are also ruthless, corporate, and violent. Hosea's execution is not justice in a courtroom. It is a street killing by a powerful agency making an example. This ambiguity is central to the game. The outlaws are guilty, but the civilization replacing them is not clean. Hosea's death therefore belongs to the larger theme of modernization. The old outlaw con man dies, not because he is morally innocent, but because his kind of criminal life no longer has room to maneuver. The new world has banks, agencies, cities, files, and coordinated force. Hosea's charm cannot talk down a system designed to crush him. The fox is caught not by a better fox, but by the arrival of the machine. The emotional aftermath of Hosea's death can be seen in the way the gang loses patience with subtlety. After Saint Denis, plans become more desperate, trust becomes thinner, and Dutch's speeches become more defensive. Hosea's style of crime required time, disguise, and careful social reading. Beaver Hollow's crimes feel harsher, more panicked, and more morally degraded. That is not accidental. The man who preferred quiet theft is gone, and the men who remain are running out of quiet options. Hosea's memory also sharpens Arthur's distrust of Micah. Arthur never likes Micah, but after Hosea's death, the contrast becomes more painful. The old advisor who loved the gang is gone. The new advisor loves only himself. Dutch's choice of company becomes a moral sign. A leader is revealed by whose voice he lets closest. Dutch once had Hosea. Then he has Micah. That change tells the whole story. If Hosea had lived longer, he might have pushed harder for John, Abigail, and Jack to leave. This is speculation, but it follows from his character. He knew the value of leaving because he once tried with Bessie. He knew the cost of failing to stay gone. He knew children did not belong in the path of bullets. Hosea might not have escaped himself, but he may have helped others see the door. Arthur eventually does that work in his own way, and it feels like something Hosea would have understood. Hosea's tragedy is not that he never saw the truth. It is that seeing the truth was not enough. He saw Dutch changing. He saw Micah's danger. He saw the world closing. He saw that violence was increasing. He saw that the old life was ending, but he could not untangle himself from love, loyalty, need, habit, and hope. That is why he feels so human. Many tragedies are not caused by ignorance alone. They are caused by people who know enough and still cannot leave. The phrase "old fool" sometimes seems to hover around Hosea, but the story never truly treats him as foolish. It treats him as limited. Wisdom has limits. Age has limits. Love has limits. A man can know the shape of a storm and still be standing under it when it breaks. Hosea's death is painful because he deserved better than being proven right by disaster. He deserved to sit with Bessie's memory somewhere far from Banks and Pinkerton's. Instead, he dies inside the very pattern he warned against. Hosea's entire life can be read as a struggle between performance and truth. As a con man, he survives through performance. As Dutch's partner, he helps perform the dream of outlaw freedom. As a husband, he encounters someone who sees through him and loves him anyway. As an elder, he tries to tell the truth about the gang's decline. His tragedy is that the performances outlive his ability to control them. Dutch keeps performing leadership. Fazbear no, not here. The gang keeps performing family. The world keeps performing civilization. Hosea dies when the truth finally breaks through the act. The mention of performance matters because Hosea understands how people become trapped by their own roles. Dutch becomes trapped by the role of visionary leader. Arthur becomes trapped by the role of loyal enforcer. John is trapped by the role of irresponsible son until he learns otherwise. Hosea is trapped by the role of old advisor and co-founder. He can see beyond the role, but leaving it would mean abandoning people he loves. The camp becomes a stage where everyone knows the lines until the play turns deadly. Hosea's love for Dutch is perhaps the saddest love in his story after Bessie. It is not romantic, but it is deep, old and fraternal. He remembers the young Dutch, the clever Dutch, the charming Dutch. the man who could inspire lost people and make them feel brave. Watching that man become paranoid and cruel must be a private grief before it becomes a public disaster. Hosea is not only worried about the gang, he is mourning his friend while his friend is still alive. This kind of mourning is difficult because it has no funeral. Dutch is still there, speaking, planning, demanding, smiling and raging. But the man Hosea trusted is disappearing. That is a special kind of loss, watching someone remain physically present while their better self recedes. Hosea's arguments with Dutch carry that grief. He is not only saying this plan is bad, he is asking, somewhere underneath, what happened to you? Dutch, for his part, may still love Hosea, but he increasingly cannot receive him. Pride makes love defensive. If Hosea's warning is right, then Dutch must face failure. Dutch would rather treat doubt as betrayal than let it become a mirror. This is why Micah's flattery is so effective. It offers Dutch a version of himself that does not have to grieve, apologize, or change. Hosea offers truth. Micah offers escape from truth. Dutch chooses escape. The relationship between Hosea and Bessie offers a quieter mirror to Dutch and Annabel. Both men loved women who died before 1899. Both losses shaped them, but Dutch turns Annabel's death into fuel for a feud and part of his legend, while Hosea carries Bessie with a more private ache. This difference tells us much about them. Dutch dramatizes grief until it serves identity. Hosea absorbs grief until it becomes humility. Neither is free from pain, but they metabolize it differently. Hosea's private grief may be one reason he is more compassionate toward other people's longing. He knows what love costs. He knows what it means to fail at leaving and then lose the person who might have made leaving possible. This gives him a sadness that is not theatrical. He does not need to make Bessie into a speech. She is simply there, in the pauses, in the memory of country they once crossed, in the old man's eyes when the past comes too near. The fact that Jamie Gillis mentions Bessie and Annabel during Arthur's Mary Linton thread is a small but important connection. It places Bessie among the lost women whose absence shaped the men of the gang. Mary is still alive, but Arthur's relationship with her is haunted by the same danger. Loving an outlaw often leads to grief. Jamie's comment suggests that perhaps Mary was spared by not being drawn fully into Arthur's world. Hosea's history quietly reinforces Arthur's tragedy. Arthur and Mary could not make a life because Arthur could not leave the gang. Hosea and Bessie tried, but Hosea drifted back. John and Abigail struggle because John is pulled between family and outlaw identity. Red Dead Redemption 2 repeats this problem across generations. Love asks the outlaw to become still. The outlaw life teaches motion, danger, and excuses. Hosea is one of the earliest examples of the failure. He loved Bessie, and still the road called him back. This makes Hosea's warnings about Dutch even more painful. He is not simply criticizing another man's delusion. He recognizes a pattern he knows in himself. The promise of one more job, one more score, one more chance, one more escape has already cost him. He can see Dutch turning that old temptation into a religion. Hosea has no illusions about being above the gang's flaws. He is part of them. That self-knowledge is what makes his warnings honest. Hosea's death does not give him a clean redemption, because Red Dead Redemption 2 rarely works that way. He does not die saving a child or making one final sacrifice by choice. He dies caught in a robbery. That matters. His end is not morally neat. But tragedy does not require neatness. Hosea's life has value because of the love he gave, the warnings he offered, the people he helped raise, and the restraint he tried to preserve. His death is senseless in the way many deaths in the game are senseless. It is not a perfect moral statement. It is a loss. The lack of a grand final speech from Hosea is part of the realism. Real people often die without saying the thing everyone needed to hear. Hosea does not get to tell Arthur to leave Dutch. He does not get to tell Dutch he has lost himself. He does not get to say goodbye to Bessie in some dreamlike vision. Milton shoots him, and the world moves violently on. The abruptness is the point. Wisdom can be killed mid-sentence. After Hosea's death, Arthur's world becomes colder. There are still allies, Charles, Sadie, Abigail, John and others, but the old parental structure is broken. Hosea's absence leaves Arthur facing Dutch without the person who could remember the beginning beside him. This is psychologically important. It is easier to question a father when another father stands nearby. Once Hosea is gone, Arthur's doubt becomes lonelier, more dangerous, and more necessary. Hosea's influence on Arthur's final choices is subtle but real. Arthur does not simply become good out of nowhere. The seeds of care, observation, humour and scepticism have been in him for years. Hosea helped plant some of them. When Arthur begins choosing John, Abigail, Jack, Sadie and truth over Dutch's commands, he is not only rebelling, he is listening at last to the quieter wisdom that had always been present in the gang. Hosea dies, but his way of seeing survives in Arthur for a little while. The difference between Hosea and Dutch can also be seen in how they handle uncertainty. Hosea can say he does not know, can admit danger, can change his mind, can stop chasing the bear. Dutch treats uncertainty as something to conquer with confidence. This becomes fatal because the late gang needs humility more than certainty. The world is too complicated, too watched, too modern. Hosea's uncertainty is wisdom. Dutch's certainty becomes madness. Hosea's cons depend on understanding uncertainty. A con man never controls everything. He nudges, improvises and exits before the situation hardens. Dutch's late plans try to force reality to obey. That is why Hosea's criminal intelligence is more adaptable. He knows a lie works only while people believe it. Dutch forgets that his own leadership is also a kind of con, dependent on the gang believing him. When belief begins to fail, he demands more faith instead of changing the plan. In this sense, Hosea may understand Dutch better than Dutch understands himself. Hosea knows Dutch's charisma is a tool, and tools can be misused. He knows the leader's speech is partly performance. This does not mean Hosea thinks Dutch was always false. Performance can carry real feeling, but when Dutch begins mistaking performance for truth, Hosea sees the danger. The actor has become trapped inside the role of saviour. Hosea's entire story is filled with almosts. He almost leaves crime with Bessie. He almost keeps Dutch grounded. He almost helps the gang find a quieter path. He almost gets them one final score. He almost lives long enough to guide Arthur through doubt. These almost make him heartbreaking. He is close to wisdom, close to escape, close to saving something, but history and habit keep closing the door. Hosea is not a failure because he lacked insight. He is tragic because insight arrived without enough power. The word old follows Hosea constantly, but it should not be heard only as weakness. Old means memory. Old means witness. Old means he knew Dutch before the worst version. Old means he remembers the gang's ideals when they were less obviously rotten. Old means he carries Bessie, early Arthur, young John, failed exits, successful cons, dead friends, and the changing country inside him. When Hosea dies, an archive dies. the gang loses not only a man, but a living record of what it once claimed to be. To understand Hosea fully, it helps to imagine the early gang before it becomes crowded by the faces of 1899. There would have been fewer people, fewer tents, fewer old resentments, and more room for the dream to feel possible. Dutch and Hosea could ride into a town, read the room, decide who deserved fleecing, and leave before the consequences grew teeth. Arthur, still young, would have watched them, and learned that crime could be dressed as justice if the story was told well enough. Hosea was part of that education, and that is both his gift and his guilt. The early gang's Robin Hood quality is important, because Hosea seems more suited to that myth than to the later bloodshed. A clever theft from someone greedy, a scam against a rich fool, a robbery that embarrasses the powerful without leaving a pile of bodies. This is the sort of outlaw work Hosea can almost make charming. The moral problem is still there, but it is easier to live with. The later gang no longer has that lightness. By 1899, the jokes still exist, but the air under them is heavier. Hosea's criminal style depends on knowing when to leave. This is one of the simplest and most important rules of a con. Stay too long, and the mark has time to think. Push too hard, and suspicion grows. Return too often, and people recognize the pattern. Hosea understands this in ordinary scams, yet the gang as a whole violates the rule on a grand scale. It stays too long in the outlaw life. It pushes too hard against a changing country. It returns again and again to the fantasy that one more robbery will fix everything. That irony sits at the centre of Hosea's tragedy. He knows the rules of escape in small situations, but he cannot apply them to his entire life. He can leave a town after a con, but he cannot leave Dutch. He can abandon a bear hunt when danger grows too high, but he cannot abandon the gang when its danger becomes obvious. He can read the expression of a stranger across a table, but love makes Dutch harder to read cleanly. Hosea's wisdom is real, and still it has blind spots. Bessie is the clearest proof that Hosea once understood the need to leave. Their attempt at a quieter life was not a rumour of old age. It was natural road taken for a while. They travelled together, away from the gang's rhythm, and Hosea tasted something like ordinary freedom. That makes his return to crime especially sad. He did not return because he had no imagination. He returned because the outlaw self inside him was stronger than the peaceful self he wanted to become. Bessie loved him through that contradiction, which may have made the contradiction even harder to escape. One can hear Bessie's importance in the way Hosea speaks of her without needing many words. Some grief announces itself loudly. Hosea's grief sits lower, as if it has been worn smooth by years of carrying. He does not need to explain Bessie to everyone. He knows who she was. He knows what they tried. He knows how he failed, and how she stayed. That private knowledge makes him feel older than age alone. He is old with memory, not only with years. The story never tells us everything about Bessie's death, and that absence is fitting. Red Dead Redemption 2 often lets the dead remain partly private. We know Bessie mattered. We know she is gone. We know Hosea loved her. We know she understood him enough to accept his criminal nature. The missing details leave room for the kind of grief that real people carry, not a complete biography, but a name that changes the temperature when spoken. Hosea's mention of Bessie during the bear hunt is powerful, because it arrives while he is doing something practical. He is not sitting in a candlelit room delivering a confession. He is riding through country, hunting, talking to Arthur, and memory rises naturally from the land. That is how grief often works. A place brings back a person. A trail, a ridge, a stand of trees, or the smell of cold air can suddenly open a door. Hosea's past with Bessie is stored in geography. That connection between land and memory is especially important in Red Dead Redemption 2, where locations often hold emotional history. Horseshoe Overlook holds temporary peace. Clemens Point holds false warmth before disaster. Shady Bell holds decay and approach to the city. Beaver Hollow holds rot. For Hosea, the Grizzlies hold Bessie. They hold the old attempt to live differently. When he rides there with Arthur, he is not only hunting a bear, he is passing through the ghost of his own almost redemption. Hosea's relationship with Arthur during the hunt shows a rare kind of ease. Arthur can be rough with many people, guarded with others, and obedient with Dutch, but with Hosea there is a softer rhythm. They tease each other like family. Hosea gives advice without smothering him. Arthur listens without feeling diminished. It is one of the clearest glimpses of what Arthur's upbringing could be, when Dutch's ego was not filling the space. Hosea is fatherly without making fatherhood a performance. This matters because Arthur's tragedy is partly the tragedy of choosing between fathers. Dutch has the louder claim. He saved Arthur, raised him, taught him ideals, and demands loyalty with emotional force. Hosea's claim is quieter, but perhaps healthier. He does not need Arthur to believe in him as a prophet. He only wants him to think, survive, and see clearly. Arthur spends much of the game still caught in Dutch's gravity. By the end, the Hosea side of his inheritance feels stronger, though Hosea is no longer alive to see it. Hosea's influence on Arthur's humour is easy to imagine. Arthur's dry remarks, his ability to see through nonsense, his impatience with fools, and his occasional delight in a well-timed lie all feel compatible with Hosea's teaching. Dutch may have taught Arthur the grand language of freedom, but Hosea likely taught him the pleasure of undercutting false importance with one tired look. Arthur's wit is not only cruelty or defence, sometimes it is wisdom refusing to dress up. Young Arthur would also have learned from Hosea how to behave around different classes of people. A con man has to move between rough camps, rich parlours, town streets, stables, banks, farms and backrooms. He must know when to sound polite, when to sound foolish, when to sound trustworthy, and when to disappear. Arthur is not as smooth as Hosea, but he can perform when needed. He can play debt collector, ranch hand, guard, customer, drunk, or gentleman for a moment. Some of that flexibility belongs to the world Dutch and Hosea trained him in. Hosea's relationship with John is more distant in the main story, but no less important in the background. John is not as eager to please the elders as Arthur was. He runs away from the gang for a time, fails Abigail, and struggles with responsibility. Hosea likely understands this with a mixture of irritation and recognition. John is another boy raised in a life that makes ordinary manhood difficult. The gang teaches loyalty and skill, but not peace. Hosea knows that better than anyone, because he once failed to stay peaceful himself. If Arthur is the son who stayed too loyal, John is the son who cannot stand still long enough to become trustworthy until suffering teaches him. Hosea's position between them is quiet but meaningful. He belongs to the generation that made both men what they are. He can be proud of them, disappointed in them, and responsible for them all at once. That complicated fatherhood is one of the moral burdens of the old gang. Dutch and Hosea rescued boys from danger, then raised them into another danger. Hosea's presence also helps explain why the early gang could feel like family rather than only a gang. He brings domestic intelligence to a criminal camp. He knows people need food, money, morale, plans, jokes, stories, and the feeling that someone older is watching the horizon. Dutch supplies belief, but belief without care becomes empty. Hosea's care is not always soft, but it is practical. He notices when the group needs caution. He notices when Dutch is pushing too far. He notices when violence is becoming too easy. The gang's campfire atmosphere depends heavily on men like Hosea. A young gang can survive on adrenaline for a while, but a long-lasting gang needs storytellers and elders. Hosea carries continuity. He can remember when Arthur was young, when Dutch was different, when Bessie was alive, when scams were cleaner, when the law felt farther away. Around a fire, memory becomes social glue. Without memory, a gang becomes only whoever is strongest today. Hosea helps keep the gang from becoming that, until he is gone. This is why his death feels like a cultural loss inside the camp. Hosea is not only one less gun, or one less planner, he is one less person who remembers the gang before its corruption became obvious. After he dies, younger members lose access to that living comparison. Dutch can rewrite the dream more easily when fewer people remember the original. Hosea's memory was an obstacle to Dutch's self-mythology. Dead men cannot interrupt speeches. Hosea's dislike of Micah also has a social dimension. Micah is not merely dangerous in action, he is corrosive in atmosphere. He changes how people talk, what cruelty becomes permissible, and how Dutch's ego is fed. Hosea understands atmosphere because cons depend on it. A room can be warmed, poisoned, distracted, or sharpened. Micah poisons rooms. Hosea feels that poison early, and his inability to remove it becomes one of the gang's most painful failures. There is a quiet cruelty in the fact that Dutch increasingly accepts the flatterer over the friend. Hosea's loyalty has decades behind it. Micah's loyalty is theatrical and self-serving. But Dutch, under pressure, begins valuing the voice that makes him feel powerful over the voice that keeps him honest. This is a common human disaster, made deadly by guns and lawmen. Leaders often fall when they confuse disagreement with betrayal and flattery with faith. Hosea sees that confusion forming, but Dutch no longer wants the cure. Hosea's warnings are often tactical and moral at the same time. When he warns against Bronte, against heat, against foolish plans, he is not separating strategy from conscience. In his mind, bad morality and bad strategy often meet. Killing for pride brings attention. Cruelty creates enemies. Recklessness ruins opportunity. The gang's old ethics, however imperfect, were also survival tools. Dutch forgets that. Hosea remembers that a man who keeps creating enemies eventually runs out of exits. This is why Hosea's criminality feels older and stranger than Micah's. Hosea's crimes require society to continue functioning. He needs towns, trust, vanity, property, fences and conversations. Micah's violence only needs weakness and opportunity. Hosea is parasitic on civilization in a clever way. Micah is predatory in a direct way. Dutch once needed Hosea's clever parasitism to keep the gang subtle. Late Dutch increasingly tolerates Micah's predation, and the gang becomes less survivable because of it. Hosea's approach to robbery also reveals respect for proportion. The job should be worth the risk. The target should be chosen carefully. The exit should be possible. The noise should be limited. The Saint-Denis bank job violates that sense of proportion, not because a bank is never worth robbing, but because the circumstances have become terrible. Bronte is dead, the city is alert, the gang is known, and the Pinkertons are close. Hosea may still plan it, but the old proportions are broken. That broken proportion is what makes St. Denis feel fatal before the first shot. The gang wants the bank to be a solution, but the city itself feels like a warning. Streetcars, police, alleys, crowds, money, and modern architecture surround them. The old outlaw fantasy has entered a place built to record, respond, and trap. Hosea's genius belongs to human-scale deception. St. Denis is a system. A system does not blush, brag, or get drunk in the same way a mark does. Hosea's capture during the bank robbery is therefore more than a failed distraction. It is the moment when performance is defeated by surveillance and force. He tries to draw the eye elsewhere, but the Pinkertons already see too much. The old art of misdirection cannot overcome a prepared net. This is why his death feels historically larger than one man's bad luck. The con is caught by modern coordination. The trickster is dragged into the open. Abigail's part in the distraction is important too, because it places Hosea beside one of the people he might most want protected. Abigail survives, but Hosea does not. The plan pulls a mother into danger, and that fact alone shows how desperate the gang has become. Earlier, Hosea might have tried to keep certain lines clearer. By St. Denis, every line is blurred. Mothers, old men, young men, sons, and leaders all move toward the same bank because the gang has convinced itself there is no other way. Hosea's death in front of the gang also weaponizes helplessness. Arthur and the others are armed, dangerous, and loyal, but in that instant they cannot save him. Milton understands the value of making them watch. Hosea spent much of his life preventing situations from reaching that kind of helplessness. He built plans to avoid being cornered. His final moment is the corner he always feared. No con left, no route left, no time left, only a gun and a message. There is no dignity in Milton's act, and that lack of dignity matters. Hosea deserved at minimum an ending proportionate to his life, a last joke, a clever bargain, a quiet death beside the people who loved him. Instead, he is executed like an object lesson. Red Dead Redemption 2 often denies characters the deaths they deserve. Lenny dies running. Sean dies mid-sentence. Kieran dies mutilated. Hosea dies displayed. The cruelty of these deaths is part of the game's anti-romance. Outlaw life does not guarantee poetic endings. Hosea's death also helps separate Arthur's loyalty to the gang from his loyalty to Dutch. Before the collapse, those loyalties seem almost identical. Dutch is the gang, or so everyone has been taught. After Hosea dies, after John is abandoned, after Abigail is left, Arthur begins to understand that the people and the leader are not the same. Hosea represented that distinction while alive. He loved the gang enough to challenge Dutch. Arthur eventually does the same, but by then the cost is enormous. Hosea would likely have understood Arthur's tuberculosis with a sad practical clarity. He would not have turned it into mystical proof or dismissed it as weakness. He would have known the body has limits. He would have known time changes when illness enters the room. Arthur faces that truth without Hosea, but one can imagine Hosea's old voice cutting through the noise. Stop wasting what little road is left. Do something that matters. Do not spend your last days feeding another man's pride. That imagined advice matters because it shows what Arthur lacks after St. Denis. He has Sadie, Charles, John, Abigail, and his own conscience, but he no longer has the old father who could speak to him from decades of failure. Hosea's life was a warning Arthur could have used in Chapter 6. Do not wait too long to leave. Do not let love for the gang become obedience to a dying dream. Do not mistake one last job for redemption. Arthur learns these lessons anyway, but alone and late. Hosea's own failure to leave gives Arthur's final success a deeper sadness. Arthur does what Hosea could not do fully. He uses his remaining strength to help John, Abigail and Jack escape the pattern. Hosea once tried to leave with Bessie, but returned. Arthur cannot save himself, but he helps someone else leave. In that sense, Arthur completes a moral movement that Hosea began, but never finished. The old man's regret becomes the younger man's final direction. John's later life at Beecher's Hope also carries an echo of Hosea and Bessie. A man shaped by outlaw life tries to become a husband, father and rancher. Hosea tried to go straight with Bessie and drifted back. John tries with Abigail and succeeds for a while, though history eventually comes for him. The pattern repeats with variation. Red Dead Redemption is full of men trying to become still after lives of motion. Hosea is one of the earliest warnings that stillness is harder than it looks. Hosea's possible awareness of his own decline also makes his urgency in 1899 understandable. He is old and not fully healthy. He may feel that his time to secure anything for the gang is short. This could contribute to his willingness to support one more big job, despite his caution. Desperation is not only Dutch's disease. Hosea may be desperate too, but in a quieter way. He wants to leave the family with enough to survive before his body and the world both give out. This adds complexity to the Saint-Denis bank robbery. Hosea is not suddenly a fool. He is an old man under pressure, trying to use the kind of plan that once worked before the conditions fully vanish. He may see the danger and still think the risk is necessary. That is what makes tragedy hurt. The fatal choice is often not made because no one sees the risk. It is made because all options feel bad, and one dangerous option still looks like hope. Hosea's plan failing also reminds us that wisdom is not certainty. A wise man can make a wrong call. A careful planner can underestimate heat. A cautious elder can be swept into a group's panic. This prevents Hosea from becoming too clean a contrast with Dutch. Dutch is worse, but Hosea is not perfect. He is implicated in the disaster, and his death does not erase that. It makes him more human, not less lovable. The tragedy of Hosea is therefore not the tragedy of a pure man destroyed by fools. It is the tragedy of a flawed man who understood more than most and still could not stop the flaws he shared. He loved the gang, profited from crime, helped raise boys into outlaw life and planned dangerous jobs. He also warned, loved, restrained, remembered, and cared. Red Dead Redemption 2 is mature enough to let all of that be true at once. Hosea's place in the gang's moral ecology is unique. Strauss represents cold financial exploitation even without much violence. Micah represents open cruelty. Dutch represents idealism corrupted by ego. Arthur represents loyalty struggling toward conscience. Hosea represents compromise aware of itself. He knows the gang is criminal, but still hopes it can be decent in some limited way. That hope is noble and naive at once. The world eventually proves the limit. The conflict between Hosea and Strauss is not explicit in the same way as other conflicts, but they represent different kinds of non-violent crime. Hosea's cons are social and theatrical, often aimed at those he can read. Strauss's debt work is dry, legalistic, and predatory toward the poor. Hosea may be a liar, but Strauss turns suffering into arithmetic. This contrast matters because Red Dead Redemption 2 does not treat all quiet crime as equal. A gunshot is not the only kind of violence. Hosea understands at least some moral differences that Strauss ignores. Hosea's quiet kindness also appears in the way he cares about camp morale. He may not be as openly nurturing as some, but he understands that people need more than money. They need jokes, plans, food, a sense of direction, and the belief that their elders are not panicking. Hosea tries to provide that steadiness even when he himself is afraid. That is an elder's burden, to carry worry without spreading it too quickly. In this way, Hosea is closer to a tired captain than a simple advisor. Dutch may wear the captain's hat in spirit, but Hosea often watches the weather. He sees clouds Dutch calls opportunity. He notices when the crew is fraying. He senses when the ship is too close to rocks. But the ship belongs to Dutch's name, and Dutch increasingly refuses to change course. Hosea can warn from the deck, but he cannot seize the wheel without breaking the family. That inability to seize control is important. Some might wonder why Hosea does not simply overthrow Dutch or take people away, but the gang's emotional structure makes that nearly impossible. Dutch is not only a leader, he is a father, symbol, and founding myth. Hosea challenging him too directly could split the group, and Hosea loves the people who would be hurt by that split. He is trapped by the same family structure he helped create. The gentler co-founder cannot easily dismantle the dream without harming the children of that dream. Hosea's position therefore resembles someone in a failing household who keeps trying to manage the damage rather than abandon the house. He patches leaks, argues quietly, moves furniture away from the fire, and hopes the roof holds one more night. But the foundation is cracking. By the time a full break seems necessary, it may already be too late. This domestic image suits the gang because it is not only an organisation, it is a home, and leaving a home can feel like betrayal even when the home is unsafe. The sadness of Hosea is intensified by the fact that he can still enjoy life. He is not a man who has entirely given up. He enjoys a good scam, a joke, a ride, a memory, a hunt, a conversation, and the company of people he loves. This makes his doom less abstract. He is not waiting to die as a symbol. He is living, with all the small pleasures old criminals can still find. The gunshot in St. Denis cuts off not only wisdom, but ordinary future mornings he might have had. Imagine Hosea in a quieter ending, far from St. Denis. He might have sat on a porch somewhere, telling lies to children that were harmless for once, cheating at cards for pennies, remembering Bessie without needing to run from the memory, and writing letters he would never send. That ending was probably never likely, but its possibility hurts. Red Dead Redemption 2 often lets us imagine the peaceful lives characters were too damaged, trapped, or unlucky to reach. Hosea's peaceful life would still have carried guilt. He could not become innocent by retiring, but he might have become still enough to understand his guilt without adding to it. That is one of the differences between survival and redemption in this world. Some people need time to sit with what they have done. Hosea never gets that time. His last years are spent trying to keep the old machine running while knowing it is breaking. The fact that Hosea remains respected by so many suggests that people in the gang feel his care even when they do not name it. Respect is not only fear. Bill may fear Dutch, younger members may admire Arthur, but Hosea's respect comes from trust that he is thinking. In a dangerous life, a thinker is precious. People can sleep a little easier when they believe someone old and clever is awake somewhere, considering the next move. When that thinker dies, sleep becomes harder. The gang after Hosea has fewer quiet minds and more loud needs. Dutch needs faith. Micah needs advantage. Arthur needs truth. John needs escape. Abigail needs safety. Suddy needs revenge and purpose. Charles needs moral action. Everyone is pulled by need, but the old mediator is gone. The result is not only strategic failure, it is emotional fragmentation. The family becomes a collection of survival instincts. Hosea's memory also helps frame the difference between Dutch's early ideals and late excuses. Early ideals, however flawed, may have included genuine opposition to exploitation and sympathy for the poor. Late excuses use the same language to justify increasingly selfish choices. Hosea can tell the difference because he remembers when the words had more life in them. This is one of the worst things about watching someone decline. They may keep using the same words after the meaning has died. Dutch still says freedom, loyalty, and family. Hosea hears how the words are changing. Freedom becomes escape from consequences. Loyalty becomes obedience to Dutch. Family becomes a hostage word used to shame dissent. Hosea's warnings are attempts to rescue the old meanings before Dutch empties them completely. He fails, but the attempt matters. Words are part of the gang's soul, and Dutch's corruption is partly linguistic. Hosea hears the language going bad. Arthur eventually hears it too. By chapter 6, Dutch's speeches no longer comfort him. They sound like delay, evasion, and control. Hosea prepared Arthur for that recognition, even if Arthur did not know it. The old man's skepticism becomes a seed that sickness and loss finally force to grow. In a story full of guns, one of Hosea's legacies is doubt. Not cynical doubt that destroys all loyalty, but moral doubt that asks whether loyalty is still serving love. Hosea's life also raises the question of whether the gang could ever have survived without Dutch. The answer is probably no, at least not as the same family. Dutch's charisma gathered people, but Hosea's steadiness helped them last. Remove Dutch, and the dream loses its fire. Remove Hosea, and the dream loses its brakes. The gang needed both, and both were flawed. That combination built the family and doomed it. Fire and brakes make movement possible until the fire grows too hot and the brakes fail. The metaphor of brakes matters because Hosea is not the opposite of Dutch. He is not law. He is not civilization. He is not innocence. He is restraint within outlawry. He does not stop the wagon from moving, he tries to keep it from flying off the cliff. When he dies, the wagon does not stop being criminal. It becomes less controlled. Dutch without Hosea is not pure Dutch revealed from nowhere. He is Dutch without the person most able to slow him down. Hosea's sense of timing also makes his own death feel like a terrible missed cue. A con succeeds when everyone enters and exits at the right moment. In Saint Denis, the timing belongs to Milton. Hosea is brought out at exactly the moment that will break the gang's concentration and spirit. The old performer becomes part of someone else's performance. Milton stages his death as a warning, and the gang is forced to watch the scene he directs. This reversal is cruel, because Hosea spent his life directing attention. He knew how to make people look left while the real work happened right. In his final moments, he is the thing everyone is made to look at. His body becomes the distraction, the message, the proof of Pinkerton power. The con man is turned into a prop by a larger machine. That is one of the coldest ironies in his story. Hosea's body also marks a change in how death appears to the gang. Sean's death is shocking and sudden, Kieran's is horrific and mutilating, but Hosea's death is ceremonial in its public cruelty. Milton presents him. The street becomes a stage. The law's hired gun performs dominance. This kind of death tells the gang they are not merely in danger from rival outlaws, They are being hunted by systems that understand symbolism too. The Pinkertons know how to break stories. The gang's story after Hosea becomes a story of broken symbols. Dutch's leadership symbol decays. The camper's family decays. The dream of Tahiti becomes absurd. The idea of one last job becomes a curse. Hosea had been one of the symbols still functioning. Old wisdom, old partnership, old affection. When he dies, symbolic collapse accelerates. The gang no longer has enough healthy meanings left to hold itself together. Even the music of Hosea's presence feels different from the rest of the gang. He belongs to quieter strings, old jokes, soft melancholy, and the creak of a chair near a fire. Dutch belongs to brass and speeches. Micah belongs to sharp, ugly noise. Arthur belongs to low, weary resolve. Hosea's tonal place matters because Red Dead Redemption 2 is deeply atmospheric. A character's lore is not only what happens to him, it is the feeling that enters a scene when he appears. Hosea brings weathered calm, and after he is gone the weather changes. The phrase "the old fox" suits Hosea because foxes survive through cleverness rather than force. A fox knows routes, holes, scents and timing. It does not challenge a bear head-on, it slips away. Hosea's tragedy is that he becomes a fox inside a shrinking world where the holes are being filled. The Pinkertons, cities, railroads and Dutch's mistakes remove escape routes one by one. A fox without a den is only an old animal in the open. Hosea's conman charm also has a shadow. It may have helped him avoid self-confrontation for years. A man who can talk others into things can often talk himself into things too. He can tell himself crime is temporary, one more job is reasonable, Dutch can still be reached, the gang can still survive, and the St. Denis Bank can still work. The talent for persuasion turns inward. This is the danger of being good with stories. Eventually, the most dangerous mark may be yourself. Dutch is the obvious master of self-deception, but Hosea is not immune. His self-deception is quieter, more modest and more sympathetic. He does not imagine himself a messiah. He imagines he can manage decline. He imagines he can keep Dutch from going too far. He imagines caution can survive inside a group increasingly driven by panic. These are kinder illusions than Dutch's, but illusions all the same. Hosea's realism is deep, yet not complete. This makes his character richer. If Hosea were purely wise, the story would be simpler. Instead, he is wise and compromised, loving and guilty, cautious and still reckless enough to rob St. Denis, sceptical and still loyal to Dutch, tired and still unable to leave. He is a person, not a lesson. The lesson comes from the whole shape of him, contradictions included. Hosea's place among the older dead of the gang also connects him to people like Davy and Mac Callender, Jenny Kirk, and the unseen losses of Blackwater. By the time the main story begins, the gang is already grieving. Hosea carries that grief as part of his elder role. He knows the campers survived deaths before, but he also knows each loss removes something. The gang's collapse is not caused by one death alone, it is accumulation. Hosea's death is the loss that makes the accumulation unbearable. The deaths of Hosea and Lenny together in St. Denis create a brutal generational wound. Hosea is the old wisdom. Lenny is young promise. One dies in the street as an example, the other dies on a rooftop while fleeing. The gang loses past and future in the same disaster. This pairing is one reason the bank robbery feels like a point of no return. It does not only cost manpower, it costs time itself, the elder who remembers, and the youth who might have become more. Arthur's grief for Lenny is immediate and visible in the chaos, but Hosea's loss sinks deeper over time. Lenny's death feels like the murder of possibility. Hosea's death feels like the murder of guidance. Together, they leave Arthur with fewer reasons to believe Dutch's path can lead anywhere good. The rooftop and the street become two halves of the same answer. The gang cannot protect its young or its old anymore. Hosea's absence also affects how we understand Dutch's later treatment of John. Hosea helped raise John. He would not have easily accepted Dutch leaving him in prison or dismissing Abigail's fear. Dutch's willingness to abandon John becomes more possible after the old co-parent is gone. Hosea's death does not cause Dutch's cruelty, but it removes one of the people who could have named it with authority. Without Hosea, Dutch can more easily rewrite abandonment as strategy. In a broader sense, Hosea represents relational memory. He remembers who belongs to whom, who raised whom, who owes whom, and what the family has promised itself. Dutch increasingly remembers only loyalty to himself. Hosea's memory is communal. Dutch's memory becomes egocentric. This is why Hosea's death matters to the moral life of the camp. The person who remembers the web is gone, and the person at the centre begins cutting strands. Hosea's legacy in John is subtle, but perhaps visible in John's eventual use of caution and planning at Beecher's Hope. John is not Hosea's natural heir in temperament, but he benefits from the older man's example through Arthur and the gang's memory. A part of John's later desire for ordinary life may be strengthened by seeing what happened to men who never escaped. Hosea's failed attempt with Bessie becomes one more warning written into the family's history. Hosea's legacy in Suddy is even more indirect. Suddy becomes a practical actor after the gang collapses, loyal to people rather than Dutch's old dream. That kind of loyalty is closer to Hosea than to Dutch. She does not waste time on speeches. She acts, helps, fights, and moves. Hosea would likely have found her reckless, but he may also have respected her clarity. In the ruined world after St. Denis, practical loyalty becomes the closest surviving descendant of Hosea's ethics. Hosea's legacy in Charles is perhaps the calmest. Charles, like Hosea, often sees through foolishness and acts from grounded moral sense. He is less theatrical, less criminally playful, and more physically capable, but he shares Hosea's distrust of unnecessary violence. Charles becomes one of the people who helps preserve what was decent in the gang after Hosea dies. He does not replace Hosea, but he carries a related steadiness into the epilogue. This pattern shows that Hosea's influence does not vanish, even though he dies before the final chapter. Influence rarely works like a speech. It works through habits others carry forward. Arthur's doubt, Charles's steadiness, Sadie's practical loyalty, John's eventual family effort. None of these belong only to Hosea, but all are compatible with the better world Hosea hoped the gang could still choose. The old man dies, but the possibility he represented flickers in others. The sorrow is that those flickers are scattered. If Hosea had lived, perhaps he could have gathered them sooner. Arthur, John, Sadie, Charles, Abigail, and Hosea together might have formed a counterweight strong enough to leave Dutch behind earlier. But the story does not give them that arrangement. It gives them loss, confusion, sickness, and pressure. By the time the right people see each other clearly, Hosea is already part of the past. The entire lore of Hosea Matthews therefore works like a quiet prelude to Arthur's final awakening. Hosea sees first, Arthur sees later. Hosea warns but cannot break free. Arthur breaks free but cannot live. John lives for a while but cannot outrun the old world forever. The tragedy passes from elder to son to younger brother, each man learning too late from the previous one's failure. Hosea is the first sorrowful teacher in that chain. Hosea's grave is not visited in the same emotional way as Arthur's by the main story's end, but his memory rests over everything that follows. Every time Dutch makes a worse choice, Hosea's absence speaks. Every time Micah gets closer, Hosea's dislike of him feels vindicated. Every time Arthur doubts, Hosea's warnings echo. The dead in Red Dead Redemption 2 do not need to appear as ghosts to haunt the story. They haunt through the shape left behind. The lore of Hosea Matthews is therefore not only the biography of an old outlaw, it is the story of a conscience that was compromised but still alive. It is the story of a con man who knew lies too well to be fooled forever, except by love. It is the story of a husband who could not stay gone from crime, a father who helped raise boys into a broken family, a friend who watched his closest partner become dangerous, and an elder who understood the end was coming before the others could bear to say it. Hosea's greatness is quiet, because he does not need to dominate the story to change it. His presence changes the emotional temperature of every camp where he sits. Things feel steadier when he is alive. Plans feel more possible. Dutch feels more human when Hosea can still argue with him. Arthur feels less alone when Hosea can still tease him. The gang feels older, deeper, and more believable because Hosea is there with his stories, schemes, warnings, and tired smile. His death is quiet in one sense and enormous in another. It happens quickly, with a gunshot in the street. But the echo travels through the rest of the game. Without Hosea, Dutch is less restrained, Arthur is more isolated, Micah is more dangerous, and the gang's old dream is less defensible. Saint Denis does not only kill a man, it kills the last strong bridge between what the gang was and what it becomes. If Dutch is the tragedy of charisma corrupted, Hosea is the tragedy of wisdom ignored. If Arthur is the tragedy of redemption arriving late, Hosea is the tragedy of warning arriving before anyone is ready to obey it. If John is the tragedy of escape that cannot outrun the past, Hosea is the man who once tried to escape and came back, proving how hard the past can pull. His life touches every major sorrow of Red Dead Redemption 2, but softly, like an old hand resting on the back of a chair. And now the camp can grow quiet around him. The old coffee pot can settle near the fire. Dutch's speeches can fade into the trees for a while. Arthur can sit nearby, younger in memory, still learning which father to trust. Bessie can remain somewhere in the cold country Hosea once crossed with her, a lost life that might have saved him if he had known how to stay. Hosea Matthews was a thief, a liar, a husband, a father, a friend, a warning, and one of the last wise voices of a dying gang. Let the night soften around his story. Let the old con man rest at last, beyond banks, Pinkertons, false dreams, and one more job. The fire is low now, and for once, nobody needs to make a plan.